And I hope we have once again reminded people that man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as a law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
I was thinking today about an anniversary. Today is December 8. 43 years ago on this day, John Lennon was shot and killed in front of his New York City apartment building in the evening. And it's interesting, have we come full circle a little bit? I think maybe we have. John Lennon used to sing about imagining. Imagine no religion, no countries. Who could have imagined that 43 years later we'd have no borders and no law and order? That would have taken quite an imagination back in 1980. By the way, what else was going on in 1980? Well, Ronald Reagan had been elected president of the United States a month before, and Jimmy Carter was at the time finishing off the worst single-term presidency perhaps in American history. And we had 52 hostages still in Iran who would come home about 6 weeks later on January 20th, 1981, on the day and time of Reagan's inauguration in Washington, just to kind of stick it to Jimmy. Interestingly, recently Jimmy's wife, Rosalind, passed away at the age of 96. And at her memorial service, some genius decided to play a rendition of John Lennon's Imagine. Interesting. But one other constant has been in place all these 43 years. Joe Biden was in Washington in 1980 as a senator, and he's the president of the United States. And he's been living off the taxpayer dollar for these 4+ decades. Really 5, because he went in the 70s, ladies and gentlemen. It's a long time. Also, it's very interesting to note that we are again, to a degree, being held hostage by Iran, now the world's foremost underwriter of terrorism, including its little franchise in the Middle East called Hamas, which on the October 7th of this year ran amok in Israel, indiscriminately killing somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 people, from infants to the elderly, not just killing, but first mutilating, raping, torturing, and then killing. It's the playbook written by Iran. So I think history is repeating itself, except now the hostage toll is a lot higher. It's the Western world, if we're not careful. And by the way, there are still 130 plus hostages held by Hamas, Israeli hostages right now. So a lot of history repeats itself, and it usually doesn't repeat itself in any way that's reassuring that mankind is, learning anything as we go. That being said, you've heard a lot lately about Christian nationalism. Now we're talking about the persecution of Jews in Israel and now the assault on their very lives. And we're seeing that persecution spill over onto our shores as untold tens of thousands of Americans are chanting in the streets over something they call pro-Palestinian rights, meaning they think that Israel should just take it when they get attacked indiscriminately, that they shouldn't retaliate. They don't know what they're talking about, of course. We can see that. But Christian nationalism really started rolling off the tongues of the left media when Mike Johnson, just another guy named Mike Johnson, was elected by his peers in the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker a few weeks ago. And he dared to utter two words in describing his worldview. He said, "Go read the Bible, the Bible." Didn't want you to think I'm Joe Biden mixing up the number of words I just said. The Bible, two words. And next thing you know, every media outlet, print, broadcast, cable, podcast, were all wringing their wrists and spewing the phrase or the two words Christian nationalism. That's just a dressed up way of mocking Christianity in this country, mocking anyone or any entity that would dare to openly state that it is guided by religious principles. Well, let me share with you a little book that came into my possession. I don't even remember when or how. An Apologetic for Liberty. It's a little book, just a little pamphlet almost. I don't know, not even 70 pages. It was distributed by an organization out of the state of Tennessee, a Christian nationalist, you might say, I guess, conservative organization called Tennessee Stands, which emerged during the ugly period of the pandemic lockdowns and all manner of trampling of our freedoms, including religious freedoms, when churches were closed and bars and casinos were open. You remember that, don't you? That was a fun time. It may come back, so let's not get too relaxed. In fact, that's exactly what they're counting on, is that we'll be caught unawares again. But the chairman of the board of Tennessee Stands is a very interesting man who has been on and off in the media spotlight for about a decade now. He's a lawyer out of the Nashville area. His name is Kevin Kookogey. And he goes back to 10 years ago when he was organizing in his state, really the precursor to Tennessee Stands, called Linchpins of Liberty. And he filed an application with the IRS seeking to obtain 501c3 status, which is what you do when you're trying to raise money as a nonprofit, under the auspices of being an educational organization. Now, the IRS, he wrote in 2013, processes more than 60,000 nonprofit applications annually, and typically takes 2 or 3 months for an organization to be granted status as a public charity. In his case, when he wrote this in 2013, he waited 27 months. In the interim, he had to pass on a $30,000 grant. And meanwhile, spending multiple thousands of his own money, as the IRS now clearly was making him a target of harassment. So fast forward to, about a decade later, and here comes this new book by Kevin Kookogey, An Apologetic for Liberty. And I think it's important at this place in time, as we contemplate anti-Semitism in the form of support for Hamas's attack on Israeli Jews on October 7th, but also really at what we've seen in school board meetings and in communities across the nation, as any connection being made between Christian faith, American values, and the conduct of society and the targeting of our children by the left. Those things make heads explode on the left. And I think one of the reasons the left is so emboldened is because very often people will stand very defiantly for their ideological beliefs, but they won't draw the line between ideology and Christian heritage and the foundation of those beliefs, which are Judeo-Christian values. Let me read to you the premise for this book by Mr. Kookogey, An Apologetic for Liberty. It is not only fitting and proper for a Christian to defend the cause of liberty, it is essential. And unless one's liberty is rooted in a Christian worldview, it will be lost. Indeed, unless the Bible is true, we can neither account for nor sustain the cause of liberty. For the Christian worldview is not merely one of many divergent paths to liberty. It is the necessary precondition to the intelligibility of liberty. On the other hand, if the Bible can be dismissed and if the people of God can be persuaded or deceived into believing that liberty doesn't matter, or that it can be set aside or sustained apart from Christ speaking through the scriptures, the enemy will have removed what even Thomas Jefferson knew was the only firm basis for securing our liberties. Quote, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, end quote. This is the time to get ready. This is the time to get ready because, as we have heard from our brethren in Israel, both those who live there and who dwell here among us of Israeli descent, who are Jewish, they're telling us, be careful not to think of this as a distant war in a faraway land, because whatever Iran is doing through Hamas to attack Israel, it would love to do on a grander scale to attack the West and ultimately to target the United States of America, my friends. And that is a scary thought. Meanwhile, in these really dangerous times, we've got idiots like the governor of Michigan, the horrifically Marxist Gretchen Whitmer, amid all kinds of economic problems and anti-Semitism in the street and crime rampant in our cities, including cities in her state like Detroit. She's focusing on a conversion of all state-owned light-duty vehicles to zero-emission electric vehicles by 2033 and all medium and heavy-duty vehicles by 2040. Just for one simple thing, by golly, to reduce pollution and lead to lower costs in the state. So while you and I know what time it is on the trajectory of history, this idiot in Michigan wants to replace the state's vehicles with electric cars, which, need to be charged, don't have a very long track record of reliability, but it's going to save money and end pollution and make the climate so much better. Boy, do I have a lot to get to today. I thought it was very interesting that the goofball Kevin McCarthy, this guy, he announced that he's the deposed, shamed ex-speaker of the House of Representatives, right? And he announced the other day that he will not seek re-election. And boy, except for a few of his constituents in California who he probably has been lining their pockets, people were generally quite relieved by that announcement, coming just a day or two after his little wingman from North Carolina, Patrick McHenry, the bow-tied boy wonder, announced that he too is too beaten up to continue after 18 years in Congress. He too will not seek re-election in 2024. But let's see what Mr. McCarthy had to say on his way, announcing that he's on his way out the door. And I hope he doesn't let him hit it in his skinny little rear end that is devoid of a spine connected to it. He said among the accomplishments which he outlined in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, he said this, that we reduced the deficit, we meaning the Republicans in the House, by more than $2 trillion, revamped work requirements for adults on the sidelines, cut red tape for critical domestic energy projects, except for not protecting the national power grid, and protected the full faith and credit of the U.S., even though Moody's has cut our credit rating, I think, twice this year. So let's look at what he said about this reducing the deficit by $2 trillion. That was a big red flag for me, bigger than that big beautiful Trump flag right here over my shoulder. That was a big red flag for me. By the way, see that plate up there? That was painted by the incredibly famous daredevil Evel Knievel, who gave it to me during an interview with him in the early 1980s, post John Lennon era, I believe, probably around 83. And yeah, that's what that is. So I'll point out from time to time the little treasures that are here in the studio that are part of my the incredibly complicated patchwork that is my humble existence. Now, we cut the deficit, said Mr. McCarthy, but here's really what they passed. The Congressional Budget Office, which is generally nonpartisan, has estimated the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is what McCarthy is referring to, would reduce deficits by $1.5 trillion between 2023 and 2033. So he didn't cut any deficits now. He's talking about some legislative mumble jumble that is alleging to cut the deficit over a period of 10 years. Okay, when we may not even have a country left when we collapse economically because of another factor that he doesn't even address, which is not deficit, it's debt. Debt is the lethal killer that is looming over our economy. Now, this report goes on to say that another entity, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, says the reduction will be between $1 trillion and $2 trillion. So it may not even get any higher than $1 trillion, which means that not only is he being disingenuous about what they actually cut, but when it's going to happen and how much it's really going to be. And now he wonders why so many members of the House, including our very own Dan Bishop of North Carolina, wanted McCarthy out and eventually got him out. Whew, that sounds good, doesn't it? And now he's going to go to K Street and make a mint as a consultant, as will he. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he and little Patrick McHenry team up as a 1 and 1A Dumb and Dumber and set up their own little shingle on K Street. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Keep an eye out for that. We'll let you know what we learn as time goes by. Now, this is interesting. Speaking of Republicans behaving badly, I have to say, I was going to mention one other thing about what politicians say and what they actually mean when they talk about cutting spending or appropriating funds for presumably positive things. Recently, our Congressman Richard Hudson, who represents Moore County, on the anniversary of the famous blackout of 2022 in Moore County, the electrical power grid attack that left us in the dark for 4 days, and you would have thought it was, East Palestine, Ohio, or Maui, which was neither of those in severity or human hardship. But boy, did the local newspaper, the Pirate, enjoy rekindling the horrors of those days in December of 22. And of course, they interviewed Hudson about it, and nobody asked him, well, gee, why is our power grid no less secure now than it was a year ago? But he did point out to us that he has secured $1.6 billion to bolster grid security. For you Democrats listening at home, bolster, that means improve or increase. Bolster, it's a good word. Through an appropriations bill that passed in the House, $1.6 billion is in that bill that's going to make us a lot safer from getting our utility stations blowed up by crazy leftists or maybe members of Hamas and Hezbollah who have come over across our U.S. border in the last year. 220,000 in September alone, and I don't know what the numbers are for the ensuing months, but they probably are just as high. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's when you break down the 1.6 billion that's in that bill. But here's the thing. This is why you have to pay attention to what our elected officials say and do. They're not necessarily lying to us, but they are very nuanced in their language. So this bill passes on October the 26th, okay? Passed by the House. Done. Nice job. Let's get some money. If you're going to spend money we don't have, at least spend it on things we actually need, okay, as opposed to electric vehicles in Michigan. So here's the deal, folks. This bill is now sitting in the Senate as of November 1. So November, this is December. It's going into its second month on the Senate legislative calendar. Well, let me just tell you this. This few days away from the Christmas season, it's not going to be addressed in this calendar year. So it's going to be next year's legislative calendar. So in other words, this money has not been allocated to do anything. It's just in a bill that the Senate hasn't even acted on yet. And remember, we don't have Republican control in the Senate. So the turtle Mitch McConnell will probably have no luck if he's even motivated to get this bill going forward. Okay, let's keep going with our busy agenda today because I've only got about 9 minutes left. Boy, the time flies when you're making great points and driving the left crazy, doesn't it? It sure does. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. I'm so happy to have the opportunity to do this and have you join me in this weekly endeavor. Now, we have understood for the past nearly 4 years that when Mark Robinson, the fairy tale candidate for lieutenant governor and victor in that race in 2020, when he was elected, the first Republican lieutenant governor in anyone's memory, maybe ever. I've lost track of those important little stats. He became, at that very moment, the presumptive nominee for governor of the state of North Carolina next year in 2024. And he has been conducting a lieutenant governorship that is essentially a campaign for governor. And I say that not as necessarily as a criticism. We're happy to have him in that office. We know he's spoken out against the sexualization of our children in schools and against vulgar books in our school libraries and those kinds of things. He is still a man, I believe, of great principle and certainly of driven by what we were talking about earlier, a Christian-rooted foundation. But recently, he was giving a speech, and he said something that sounded a little unhinged, and I'll just share it with you. This was reported by our intrepid journalist here in Moore County, the Daily Haymaker, who just maintains a extremely on-fire website, mostly covering state, but also some local politics, and mostly with an eye toward exposing hypocrisy at every turn. The dailyhaymaker.com, I suggest you check it out. Here's what Robinson said in a speech. He said, "I don't have to listen to those in my own party," meaning Republicans, "who have watched as my back has been whipped by our enemies." Interesting choice of phrase. "Who refuse to stand up with me because they're cowards." Wow. "I don't have to worry about it," he said, "because one day Jesus Christ is going to ride back to this earth on that white horse. When he does, he's going to bring his vengeance." Now, the Lord is omnipresent. And yes, he will bring his kingdom to earth again, as we know from reading the Word of God. But whether or not he's going to specifically target people who apparently are not enthusiastic enough about Mark Robinson running for governor of North Carolina, I'm not sure you can make that leap. And that kind of trivializes what we were talking about the importance of our Christian faith. Perhaps it's pointed out by Mr. Haymaker that he was responding to a recent poll conducted by Eastern Carolina University, which shows that while Mark Robinson is still the favorite for governor, his support is at 34% of GOP primary voters. Now, the support seems to be declining. In multiple previous polls, he had enjoyed 40% of GOP support going into the March primaries next year. The new poll also showed a lawyer named Bill Graham at 8%, and our incredibly successful and humble and worthy candidate for governor, State Treasurer Dale Folwell, is at 7%. But here's the key number. 49%, so roughly half of GOP voters say they're still undecided in the race for governor in 2024. And remember, if no candidate wins more than 30% of the total vote in a crowded primary, it goes to a runoff between the top two finishers. And that's where things could get really dicey. So keep an eye on this governor's race as we go into 2024. And I would say to those of you who have said, hold on a minute, have you heard what Dale Folwell, our treasurer, says about how he would conduct the business of the state of North Carolina, how he would conduct himself as a CEO, because he's highly qualified to do just that? Have you heard what he's saying? Maybe you should start listening. That's what I've been telling people. We don't have to jump off any bandwagon or onto any bandwagon. We merely have to listen to what a very effective elected official over the past 8 years has done and what he is saying now. That's all there is to it. And that's why the Robinson rant really caught my attention. Now, before we go, I wanted to quickly address a guest that we had with us here in Moore County. Well, she's visiting here. She is Israeli born. She was 12 years a member of its military. She is an entrepreneur in the FinTech world, which is financial technology, things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the like. Clearly a very intellectual young lady. She's here visiting friends and a significant other, and would have been back in Israel now, but the day that she was about to fly home was the day that Hamas attacked Israel. She spoke recently to the More Republican Women's Club at their monthly luncheon, and this young lady brought tears to my eyes, and I think to many of us in the room. I just want to share with you briefly what she asked from us as Americans. Her name is Tal Bentov. She said that all names given to Israelis have a meaning beyond the word. Her name, Tal, means morning dew. Isn't that lovely? Tal Bentov. Here's what she said. She said that she views what happened on October 7th as the most monstrous thing you can ever imagine, and that it has called up the patriotism of her fellow Israelis. It has welled it up in their hearts, and that most of her friends of her age, which is, I would guess, in her 30s back home, are back in the uniform. People she served with who were out of the military have gone back in and are wearing it again. But she made this very important point, and others have too. And there's the dog. It's either the mailman or a Democrat just walked by. She said this is not another war for us. This is bigger. We were first to be attacked. We will not be the last. And that's an important point. A very important point. Why we should pray for Israel, why we should back Israel, but why we have to understand that this is Iran's first salvo in what it views as a much bigger conquest, believe me. So we have our idiot president of the United States in Washington refusing to send money to Israel unless we send even more money to Ukraine, and saying he won't tie it to any additional funding to protect our southern border, our own homeland. But we're sending money to Ukraine to protect their border with Russia. How do you even make any sense of this? I want to leave you switching gears rather rapidly, but we do that here because, we're pretty intelligent people, and we can take on multiple topics in a 30-minute period, and we can digest them quite readily. Can we not? Yes, we can. John Ellis, a professor emeritus at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a man who has very carefully and in a very intellectual, deep dive manner, tried to explain the decline of higher education in America, and then beyond the decline, what the consequences of it are. He has written a book called The Breakdown of Higher Education: How It Happened, the Damage It Does, and What Can Be Done. I believe that book came out a few years ago, and I think I read it at the time. But he has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal which really distills where we are with education, and not just acknowledging that it's broken, but the ongoing, ever-present danger that it poses to our culture and to our children and to their children. Here it is, and I'll leave you with this. America faces a formidable range of calamities: crime out of control, borders in chaos by design, children poorly educated while sexualized and politicized against parental opposition, unconstitutional censorship, a press that does government PR rather than oversight, our institutions and corporations debased in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more. To those has been added an outbreak of virulent anti-Semitism. Every one of these degradations can be traced wholly or in large part to a single source: the corruption of higher education by radical political activists. Children's test scores have plummeted because college education departments train teachers to prioritize social justice over education. DEI started as a campus ruse to justify racial quotas. Campus anti-Semitism grew out of ideologies like anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, and intersectionality. Never have college campuses exerted so great or so destructive an influence. Once an indispensable support of our advanced society, academia has become a cancer metastasizing throughout its vital organs. The radical left is the cause, most obviously through the one-party campuses having graduated an entire generation of young Americans indoctrinated with their ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Liberty Podcast. I'm Steve Woodward. We'll see you next time. God bless you.